Yeah, it's really an interesting company, and you're welcome to come up anytime and warn me so I know I'll be here. But would love to show you around and let you take a look at things.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the great fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Everything Band is sponsored by Celtic Horizon Arts, the leading tour operator for the arts in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Celtic Horizon Arts hosts bands, orchestras, and choirs from around the world, and they are now taking inquiries for their 2020 Band Festival in Limerick, Ireland. This festival, featuring composer Johan de May, will include clinics, masterclasses, and cultural exchanges. Bands and individual musicians are all welcome to participate and can find out more by contacting Keith Kelly at keith@CelticHorizonTours.com or find out more on Facebook at Celtic Horizon Arts. Now, on to the episode and this week's guest, Andrew Glover. Hi, Andy.
Good morning.
How are you this week, this summer?
I'm doing fine.
Sorry, I screwed up the beginning. I screwed up the opening. Hi, Andy.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It must be the morning. I'm messing up the interview and we're 10 seconds in.
That's okay.
So, Andy, can you introduce yourself for the listeners and tell them who you are?
My name is Andrew Glover. I go by Andy. I am the Executive Vice President with CL Barnhouse Company, headquartered in Oskaloosa, Iowa. It's a music publisher. I've been here just under 20 years.
Excellent. And so can you give us your background, like how you got started in music and what you did before you became the editor at Barnhouse?
Sure. I kind of got into music by accident. And it's kind of a long story, and I won't bore you with the full story, but I started playing in band in the 7th grade, which was a couple years late in the school district that I was in. I got bribed into joining band with a piece of chocolate cake and started playing the French horn, and I was really awful on French horn. I was behind the other kids by 2 years, and I was struggling with this instrument, and I stuck with it for 5 years, but I was really pretty awful. But I really loved being in band. It kind of became my thing in school. A lot of school-age kids have an interest in a sport or an academic area or some area of the arts or what have you. And band kind of became my thing, even though I was really a pretty bad player. But I loved the music. I was very fascinated by the music, and I really got interested and involved in the music that we were playing. And I guess the summer before my senior year in high school, it was pretty obvious to my band director that I was going to be a music major in college. And he called me into his office one day and said, if you're going to major in music, we've got to find you an instrument you can actually play. So he switched me off a French horn, which just killed him because, when you're a band director, you never have enough French horns, no matter how bad they are. But he switched me to euphonium, and that instantly I was a better euphonium player than I'd ever been French horn player. So that's kind of how I got started in band. One of the nice lessons I learned from that experience when I was teaching was that sometimes if you have a kid who's, likes band and seems to have interest in it, but really struggles with the instrument, maybe it's time to try something different. So
yeah, I've said this on this podcast many times that I got my undergraduate degree with the trumpet as my instrument, but I wish I had played the trombone.
Well, if you do, and if you ever find fifth position, let me know.
All right, I'll look for it.
Thank you.
So, Andy, you and I share a couple of ties. I'm not from St. Louis, but I've lived there for the past 10 years, and you're from that area. That's where you went to school, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And so I was teaching at Webster University, and you graduated from Webster Groves High Schools.
I did indeed, back in 19... Yeah, but the Webster Groves area has always been, in my opinion, a really nice area of St. Louis. It's always had a pretty strong arts connection, as far as I can tell. Lots of members of the St. Louis Symphony have lived there for whatever reason. The music program at the high school has always been very good. Webster University has grown by leaps and bounds, and they have a fine music department. So I'm not sure if the Opera Theater of St. Louis is still doing its thing there on the Webster campus,
They do.
but that was another thing that was quite big in the arts community there. So it is a very arts-rich area, and good schools and good people there that support the arts.
Yeah. The community music school is there now as well. That used to be.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Andy, can you tell me about what you did after high school, where you went to school, and how you got into composition?
Well, when I graduated high school, I went to college at Central Methodist College, now Central Methodist University in Fayette, Missouri. It's a very small school in central Missouri, and they were very well known at the time, and still are, for a very extraordinary band program. I went there with the idea of playing in the band. I really was less interested in academic studies, but I really was a good player back in the day, and I enjoyed playing. And my career path at that point was to become a professional euphonium player. And so I went off to college there and played in the band, performed on a lot of recitals, played solos with the concert band, and had a really fun time doing all of that. I had actually become interested in writing and arranging music while I was still in high school. And in fact, my first arrangement was premiered when I was a sophomore in high school with the high school's wind ensemble. So that's over 40 years now that I've been at this. When I started out, I didn't really have any formal study in the area. I just looked at other pieces of band music and kind of learned about ranges from that, and would write some arrangements and take them into the high school band or later into college and get to hear them played. So that was a really great experience as far as learning how to write and arrange music for band, was to actually do it and hear it played and find out what worked and what didn't. So my first efforts were kind of self-motivated, and I was kind of self-taught at the beginning, although in college I did have some very good orchestration and theory teachers that I wish I'd have paid more attention to, but they were very helpful to me as I was trying to figure this out.
Yeah, so you had obviously had some support when you were in high school from your band director. So what can teachers today do to support young people who might want to compose or might want to arrange? What can they do to help them?
Well, I think the best thing they can do is give them the space to do that and to try out the music that they write. That, to me, is one of the biggest, we're kind of jumping around a little bit here, but one of the biggest issues I see with music submissions we get at Barnhouse, we see a lot of pieces that have obviously never been played by anybody.
Yeah.
And a lot of composers, I think, write for the computer. They write for a finale or a Sibelius playback. They don't really write for live musicians. So they try to create something that's going to sound cool when they play it back through a synthesized notation software playback, but they miss so much in terms of what it's really going to sound like and what's practical with the piece when it's played by real musicians. So having had the opportunity to write some music and hear it played by real people was incredibly helpful to me, because I could immediately hear what worked and what didn't work. And my friends in the band would tell me, oh, this is too high, or this is too hard, or this is, too low, or the instrument doesn't sound good in this range. And that kind of feedback was tremendously valuable to me.
So I want to ask you about Central Methodist. That has a history of having some pretty impressive people associated with the university and the music program, correct?
It really does. Claude Smith went there for 2 years in the early 1950s. He ultimately got his degree, I think, at the University of Kansas, but he spent 2 years at Central Methodist. David Holsinger got his undergraduate degree there. David was there in the early 1960s. At one point, that school was turning out as many music education majors as any other college or university in Missouri, which is amazing considering the size of the school. It's just a very small school, but it's turned out some excellent performers, many, many wonderful educators. some well-known composers, as noted. So it's really had quite a strong reputation in the world of music, for especially for being such a small college.
So, Andy, did you, after college, when you got your degree, did you?
Well, when I was in college, as I mentioned, my career plan was to become a professional euphonium player, and I think all of us know that that's not exactly a field with an awful lot of opportunity out there. It's certainly even less than the other wind instruments, because the euphonium obviously is not something that's in orchestras. So, if you're going to be a professional euphonium player, your options are pretty much limited to the service bands. And as I mentioned, I think I was a pretty good player back in those days. I had good teachers, and I worked very hard at it. And I played an audition for the Marine Band in 1981 and almost made it. I placed third out of 30, and they took the first two. So, missed it by that much. But at that point, that was kind of a revelation for me that, as good as I thought I wasn't good enough to get into the Marine Band. So maybe it was time to think about some other aspect of music for a career. I'd been interested in writing and arranging. I was majoring in music education. So, I had a couple other avenues open to me there. So my next career plan was to become a music teacher at Webster Groves High School. So I was waiting for a job opening to come up when I graduated from college, and the job opening did not happen. So I went off to graduate school for a year to kind of kill some time, essentially. And after a year of grad school is when I got a job back at Webster High School teaching there. And I was there only for 2 years, 2 non-consecutive years. That's also kind of a long story that I won't get into here. But so I got out of college, did a year of grad school, and then started my teaching career.
Have you always just written for wind ensemble and band, or have you written other things?
Mostly it's been for band. I've dabbled a little bit with some orchestra things. I've dabbled a very little bit with choral music, and some small ensemble music, I guess I should mention, but mostly band. I've always been fascinated by the band as a musical medium. I've always felt that the band was an incredibly versatile ensemble, that it could play all kinds of styles and kinds of music, and the colors and the sounds that a band can produce is just extraordinary. The wide variety of the palette available in the concert band, I thought, was just extraordinary. So I've mostly focused my writing activities on writing for band.
Yeah. And so, I'm going to jump around again a little bit here. And it's because I know that you also have a close connection with the Windjammers and circus bands.
Right.
And so as you talk about the versatility of the bands, can you tell me about the circus band movement and what you do with that?
Well, yeah, I got interested in circus music when I was still in high school. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but it did. And I was really fascinated by how exciting the music was. At the time, there were still record stores. You're maybe old enough to remember record stores. And if you went to a record store, you'd go way in the back and there'd be the classical section. And maybe in one little area of the classical section, there might be a band section. And so I would haunt these little band areas of the record stores when I was in high school and college, looking for any band recordings I could find. And at the time, a number of the Fennell Eastman Wind Ensemble recordings were in re-release on Mercury Records. And Fennell recorded a record called Screamers, which is a record of circus marches. And of course, wonderful recordings. The Eastman Wind Ensemble was tremendous. These were exciting, vibrant recordings, very, very well played. And I got the Screamers record and just played it to death. I just loved the thing. There was another group of records produced by Crest Records in the 1970s with Merle Evans, who had been the band director for Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus for 50 years. And using musicians from the New England Conservatory of Music, they put together a 5-record set of circus music that I also obtained. And again, wonderful performers, wonderful recordings. And I was just so excited by the vibrance of this music, how exciting it was, and how challenging it was to play. So I, for whatever reason, just really took this and ran. I started my own little circus band when I was in high school at Webster Groves. We weren't very good, but we didn't know that. We tried to play music that was too hard, but had a lot of fun trying to do it. And that kind of got me launched with circus music. as the years progressed, as I've been in and out of music at different times in my career, I always was involved with this organization called Windjammers Unlimited, which is a circus music historical society. And they get together twice a year, form some bands, and play through a bunch of older circus music for enjoyment and also for the purposes of preserving it through performance and recording. So that's been a nice endeavor for the organization to be involved with, and connecting Barnhouse to that. For whatever reason, 100 years ago, Barnhouse was the publisher that was associated with circus music. Writers like Carl King, Russell Alexander, Fred Jewell, J.J. Richards, all of the famous circus composers published at Barnhouse, which I've always found to be kind of an interesting connection. So it all kind of comes full circle now with me being here at Barnhouse and our archive of music going way back to 1886.
Yeah, I know I've mentioned it on Facebook to you, but there's one day I'm going to drive up to Oskaloosa just to see that.
You should, yes.
Yeah, it'd be terrific.
Yeah.
So I want to ask a little bit more about circus music. So I've had some experts on who talked about Civil War era brass band music, and then I had someone talk about the development of the school band movement around the turn of the century with, Sousa and that group who were pushing music education, band education. Where did circus bands fit into this sort of tapestry of band history?
Well, circuses were a lot better, I'm going to say better known 100 years ago than they are today. There were, for one thing, many more circuses active around the turn of the 20th century than there are now. And you also have to remember that entertainment options 100 or 125 years ago were considerably more limited than they are today. The circus coming to a town like Oskaloosa, Iowa, or Wentzville, Missouri, or Sterling, Illinois, was a big thing. That was a huge event for a town. And people didn't ever have a chance to see elephants or tigers or people doing crazy things on a high wire or a trapeze unless they went to a circus to see it, because there was no television, there was no film, there were no movies, there was no internet, certainly. And so as an entertainment medium, the circus was immense back 100, 125 years ago. So, to begin with, circuses were huge. They were a big deal when it came to town. And the band was a big part of what went on with the circus. Obviously, the main role of the circus band was to provide musical accompaniment during the circus performance. They would play music in a style that would fit whatever kind of act was performing. They'd play rags or trombone smears for clowns. They'd play pretty waltzes for aerial acts. They would play different kinds of pieces, minor key ponderous marches for wild animal acts. They would select music to fit the nature of whatever act was performing. And of course, the band and the band leader had to tailor the amount of music for the length of the performance. So the musicians really had to pay attention to the leader, and the leader had to watch the acts to know how long to play a certain piece, when to stop that piece and start the next one, when to play a chord for the end of the act when the performers bowed, and so forth. So it was show music, but on sort of a high level in terms of the involvement of the band with the performers, because circuses, the acts would change quickly, and so the band really had to be on its toes in order to musically keep up with what was happening in the performance. So the bands were tremendously important in the days of the golden age of the American circus. As the years progressed, and unfortunately, in my opinion, recorded music began to replace the live music that was being used in circus performances. And for example, when Merle Evans first joined the big show in 1919, he had, I think, a 28 or 32-piece band. When the Ringling Show closed for good a couple of years ago, I think they were using a 9-piece band. They were getting a lot of miles out of those 9 musicians, I can tell you that, but it was a whole different world than what had originally been associated with circuses and bands.
So can you tell me about Barnhouse? It's the oldest publisher in the United States, correct?
I'm not sure if we really can't call ourselves the oldest because there are some other companies that predate us, but we are one of the oldest publishing companies, certainly one of the oldest band-focused publishing companies in the United States. We've been around since 1886. It was started by a man named C.L. Barnhouse, Charles Lloyd Barnhouse, who was born in 1865 in Grafton, West Virginia, and he was a very successful cornetist. He worked first as a performing musician, and like so many other people of his era, was largely self-taught as a musician and dabbled in composition, was self-taught in that area too. He got some textbooks on harmony and music theory and tried to teach himself, but did most of his study by way of trial and error, just writing things to see how they would sound. And he was getting frustrated with two things in his musical life. One, he was performing as a musician with different traveling shows. It was a pretty hard lifestyle and not a whole lot of money. And I think he was getting a little tired of working so hard and not seeing very much in return. And the other thing that frustrated him was he was trying to get his music published and wasn't having very much luck. He did get one piece published by J.W. Pepper, of all people, back in 1883. But that was the only piece that he ever got published other than with his own company. So in 1886, at the age of 21, he decided that he was tired of traveling on the road and living the life of a traveling musician, and he decided to settle down and start a publishing company, which he did. So he began writing music that he published, and he did everything pretty much himself. He engraved the music himself. You have to understand that printing technology in 1886 was considerably more primitive than it is today, particularly for music printing, because you didn't have fixed type like newspapers would use. You had to actually engrave a piece of music backwards into a zinc plate using very specialized tools, which were expensive and hard to come by. Somehow he found the money to get these tools and to learn how to become a music engraver. So he not only wrote the music and engraved the music, but printed it himself and found ways to market and promote the music as well. And lo and behold, in a few short years, he was starting to have some pretty good success with this little publishing company. I think his fortunes improved quite a bit when in 1896 he found a young composer named Russell Alexander, who had been a circus musician and who went on to write some of the most famous marches ever written, such as Colossus of Columbia and The Southerner. And then in 1909, he ran into Carl King and began publishing Carl King's music as well. I think those were sort of seminal moments for the Barnhouse Company. But the company has continued and persisted throughout the years. It has evolved considerably to meet the ever-changing world of bands and what their needs are in terms of music. But here we are 132 years later, doing pretty much the same thing that C.L. Barnhouse started out to do in 1886, and that's published band music.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. So he started the company in Oskaloosa?
He actually started the company in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. He was working there as a bandmaster. He led, I think, the town band in Mount Pleasant and was there for about a year and a half, and then had a better job offer in Burlington, Iowa. And then in late in 1890, he got an offer to come to Oskaloosa. So the company has been here for all but about the first 4 years of its existence.
It's remarkable because this is right around the time that we see the boom of music publishing companies in Tin Pan Alley in New York.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that the company managed to survive that long through all that.
Yes, it is. And I think it's a testament to C.L. Barnhouse's skill and determination and some luck as well. I mean, you have to have luck in life with certain things in order to be successful. But he was apparently a pretty sharp guy, and he learned how to do things. He was kind of a self-innovator. He learned how to engrave music. He learned how to print music. He learned all of these things himself because he was very determined. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of us could benefit from studying, that sometimes hard work and determination really can pay off. But yeah, the company it certainly had its ups and downs over the years, but the company's been going quite strong for the last 50 or 60 years. Really, the most scary time in our company's history was during the Great Depression, the 1930s. C.L. Barnhouse died in 1929, just weeks after the stock market crash. And his son took over management of the business. And his son had worked at the company, C.L. Barnhouse Jr., and knew how to fill orders and how to deal with music dealers and things like that. But he really didn't have any experience on catalog management or figuring out what to publish. And it took him a long time to kind of get that figured out. This was also a time with the Depression where nobody was buying much of anything. And it was before the school band movement really took off in earnest with the baby boomers. So we had some pretty lean times in the 1930s. In 1942, with our involvement in World War II, C.L. Barnhouse Jr. came up with the idea of publishing a book of 16 marches in an easier grade level, and he went to Carl King to ask King to write this book, which became known as the Marching to Victory book. And it was the single biggest selling book collection in our company's history. And according to Chuck Barnhouse, who was the grandson of the founder, that book saved our company in the 1940s. So we owe a lot to that old Marching to Victory book and Carl King.
So, Andy, you mentioned that C.L. Barnhouse's son was sort of struggled with choosing the music. And so for 20 years, you've been the band editor, or you are the band editor at Barnhouse, which means that everything crosses through your desk, correct?
Yeah, that's mostly correct. When I came to work here 20 years ago, Chuck Barnhouse, who was the grandson of the founder, was still actively involved in the company. And Andy Clark, who is the president of C.L. Barnhouse Company, had been here for about 10 years when I got here. And Andy and Chuck were making most of the musical decisions at that point. Chuck was moving toward retirement. And so I got involved with reviewing submissions and going through that whole process. And now Andy Clark is mostly retired from the company. And my coworker in the editorial and production departments, Kim Benson, and I review all of the submissions that come through. So we are, in essence, the editorial committee. So if you're somebody listening to this whose music we've turned down, now you know who to not send the Christmas cards to.
Yeah. So what are you looking for in a piece of band music when something does come to you?
Well, the perfect piece of music for us to publish has to have several different qualities. In no particular order, they would be as follows. One is it needs to be something that is appropriate for the educational market, something that's useful as teaching material in performance music, something that a band director could use to help their kids improve from one level to another in some area of musical development. Another thing would be something that we could publish and have an expectation that it's going to be a money maker as opposed to a money loser for us. And we can talk more about this in a bit about commercial publishing versus self-publishing. One of the things in commercial publishing is that we do have some pretty significant front-end expenses on each product that we decide to publish. And so there is a point where we want to try to recover our production expenses as well as try to make a profit. We are a for-profit organization, so we do have to make money on everything that we do. It also, and this opens up a whole can of worms here, but a piece of music needs to be a good piece of music. I don't know the definition of good music, and I would defy anybody to come up with a concise definition of what good music is. But oftentimes I can listen to something and like you could or many other people, you'd have an impression or your own opinion on whether or not something is a quote good unquote piece of music. So we try to come up with things that we feel are good pieces of music that we could include in our catalog. One big area that a lot of our prospective composers, people that submit music to us, kind of miss is that we need things that are really exceptional and not just okay. There are a lot of submissions we get where we listen to them and we say to ourselves, well, that's all right, but it's not particularly compelling. There's nothing about it that really would cause a prospective customer to perk their ears up and say, wow, that's really cool, or my kids would love to play that. There's a lot of, for lack of a better term, in my estimation, mediocrity in the submissions that we receive. Oftentimes people will send us a piece of music and it's just kind of okay and not great, and we'll turn it down, and they press me as to why we turned it down. And it's hard to explain to people that, what you've written is all right, but there really isn't anything about it that's extraordinary that's going to really compel somebody to want to buy this thing. So that's tough to hear, I realize, for young composers, for somebody to say, gee, your music is good, but it's not great. But if we're going to take it, it needs to be something that we think is really startling in quality, in terms of how it will grab people's attention. So those are some of the qualities we look for. And of course, there's the obvious things, appropriateness of grade level, duration, content. If it's a programmatic piece, something where the content is appropriate for school age kids. Commissions, I see on your list of questions here, commissions are something we can talk about. A lot of times if a band or an organization commissions a piece of music, they have a very specific kind of piece of music in mind that they want. And that may or may not lend itself to the idea of commercial publication. And that's a difficult concept for a lot of people to deal with. Localized is a word that we use around here. Localized pieces of music, if it's written for the Grand Hornets Triumphal March because the school is the Grand Hornets, that's not going to be of much interest to people who aren't Grand Hornets. So things that have a specific tie to a specific school or a location that's not world famous become a potential problem for us as a prospective publication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it. And, from my perspective, I don't write every piece I don't write is extraordinary. I don't expect every piece I write to be published.
Yeah. And I think composers could stand to learn from that lesson a little bit. I saw Larry Clark not long ago posted a thing on Facebook for prospective composers that I thought was really wonderful. And one of the questions he posed back to the composers was, why do you want to be published? And I think people want to be published for a lot of different reasons. If you want to do it for the money, you're in the wrong business. I don't know anybody that's gotten rich off of publishing band music. That's just a next to impossible thing to do. Some people like the idea of the fame or the positive notoriety that comes from being published. They like to be able to tell people that they're published, and I think kind of enjoy that reputation aspect of it. And if you want to get published because you want to make money or you want to become famous, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. It's certainly admirable to want to be famous and to make a lot of money, but if you want to publish your music with a mainstream publisher, you really need to look at the potential market of customers out there. Who's going to play this piece? And is this a piece of music that bands will find interesting enough that they'll want to buy it and play it? Is it a piece? One thing I missed earlier was, is this a piece of music that audiences are going to want to hear? I'm big on programming for the audience. That's a huge part of my musical belief. And if it's something that an audience isn't going to want to sit through, it's probably not something that we're going to be very interested in either. So I think it's important for composers, if they want to write with the idea of being published, really take a good, cold, hard look at your music and ask yourself, is this really something that bands are really going to want to play and audiences are really going to want to hear, and that band directors will be so compelled to the point that they're willing to give up part of their budget to buy this piece of music? So those are all things that I think that composers interested in commercial publishing should probably look at. Now, having said that, by no means do I suggest that composers who want to write what they want to write, to express themselves or to try to reach some level of artistic expression, by no means do I mean to discourage that type of composition. But just remember that it may or may not be something that suits itself to what I call mainstream commercial band publishing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and every company has kind of a different take on that too.
Sure. And, we had mentioned we were going to talk about self-publishing versus commercial publishing. One of the benefits of being a self-published composer is that you don't have an editor who's telling you things that you need to change in order to get your piece in print. You can go with whatever you want to go with. and you don't have to compromise your artistic beliefs, for lack of a better expression, to get the music published. Now, there may not be a lot of other people who share your artistic aspirations and may not have a lot of interest in it, but that's kind of the role of the editor, is to make sure that the music is appropriate for the intended market. And it isn't the role of the editor to destroy the musical dreams of the composer, unlike some composers might suggest, but to try to do what they can with the music to make it more presentable and increase its potential to the marketplace.
Yeah, it's interesting, as I think about my own music and my own thoughts on this and all the people that I've talked to, the commercial publishing offers lots of benefits as far as having a wider spread and you get more of your music in front of people for them to look at, versus the idea of giving up a larger percentage of your potential earnings. It's the choice between quantity versus more revenue for each piece, I guess.
Yeah. One of the large mainstream band publishers obviously has the upper hand in terms of marketing and visibility. All of the major publishers do some kind of mailing at least once a year to tens of thousands of band directors. That's something that most self-published composers cannot afford to do. So right away, they have kind of a handicap in terms of their visibility. Self-published composers can do some things now that they didn't used to be able to do, marketing through online resources, through a website, through social media. Those are avenues that are now available to a self-published composer that didn't used to exist. So that's one area where it starts to level the playing field a little bit more. But, there are people who, Barnhouse has a really good reputation in the band world, particularly in the middle school and beginning band areas and younger high school. We've spent years developing this reputation with really good writers, and there are people who look at our established series and they know every year when they see new pieces in our Command series or new pieces in our Sound Foundation series, they know what they're going to get with one of those pieces of music. They know that it's something that's going to work for their 7th grade band or their 5th grade band. And a self-published composer who hasn't been out there, who doesn't have that kind of brand recognition, is at a disadvantage because they just are not known yet in the band world. There are a very small handful of self-published band composers who have been quite successful. And, I applaud them, and they've worked at it hard, and they deserve to reap the rewards of their hard work. But it's really difficult when you're either starting up your own publishing company or you're trying to self-publish to get the kind of widespread exposure and market penetration that the large major band publishers, commercial publishers have going for them.
Yeah, I look at it almost like, for the most part, the bulk of the band music is going to come from the commercial publishers. But I do think self-published composers fill a niche.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
So I think it works pretty well. It's got a nice equilibrium right now. There's a good variety of things. So
yeah. And it works both ways for us, too, because there are some band directors who just hate what we do. And they would no sooner play a Barnhouse piece than they would jump off a cliff. And so, we realize that. We're not for everybody, but we feel we're for most people. And our track record, I think, bears that out. So, there are composers in our catalog that some people really love and just can't wait to hear the next piece from them. And there's other composers in our catalog that people just despise. That's the nature of the game. It just happens that way.
Yeah, sure. So you did look forward a little bit, and you saw the question about commissions. And I want to ask about your work as a composer. I mean, we've been talking about Barnhouse and your role as the editor. How about as a composer? Can you tell me a little bit about Andy, the composer?
Sure. I don't write a lot of music. I do a lot of arrangements and transcriptions of pieces. I do write a few originals here and there. Part of it, quite candidly, is that I really don't view myself as a composer the way I view myself as a writer, somebody who can either fill a niche in our catalog based upon the specifications of what that opening is, or somebody who can take a piece of music and rearrange it and present it in a different format to fit one of our established series. And the other thing is, quite honestly, and this, again, jumping around to one of your later questions about juggling professional life and home life, I work all day in the music business, and when I go home at night, sometimes it's hard to get motivated to still do music. And, I write off the clock. I don't write as part of my job here at Barnhouse. I do that on my evenings and weekends. And, there are not a whole lot of evenings during the week where I really feel that compelled to work on music projects, since I do it during the day. So I write things kind of when the spirit hits me and when I have an idea for something. If somebody approaches me about a commission, I think very carefully about whether or not it's something I want to get involved with, not for any reason other than I want to make sure that if I do agree to get involved with the project, that I can come up with something that I know they're going to be happy with. I've turned down commissions because it was something that's not in my wheelhouse. It was not something that I felt I would really represent myself well doing, and I've recommended other people for them to contact as a potential composer for a project. So I do a little bit of original writing, and most of what I'm doing for both for our catalog and other projects is more in the arranging area.
Before I get to my final questions, I'd like to thank you all for listening and to invite you to check out my music at markjconnor.com. I'd also like to let you know that there's some exciting news right around the corner and to watch this space. Now, back to the episode. All right, Andy. So where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
Well, the word competition, when you apply it in music, is kind of an ugly word to some people. I look at this in two areas. One is when bands are involved in like competitive marching. That's a big kind of turnoff to me. I think that when bands are competing head to head in like marching competitions, or when they go to concert contests where they're ranked first place, second place, third place, I'm not a big fan of that. I don't really see the educational value in that. And in far too many instances, I've seen where the students in a band program are taught to believe that, first place is the goal. And, in music, winning a first place trophy is not the goal. That doesn't prove that you're a good musician or that you've excelled musically in what you're doing. So I think that aspect of competition in music is kind of a no-no with me. I wish fewer bands were involved in that level of competition, because I view that as being largely unhealthy. On a completely different plane with competition, I mentioned this audition that I played for the Marine Band. I walked into a room and there were 29 other euphonium players playing as well as I did. And that was kind of an eye-opener for me, because I thought I was pretty hot stuff. And it kind of knocked me down to where I needed to be, there's other people that can play as good as I can or better than I can. So, obviously, if you're playing on an audition for a major orchestra or a symphony or the wind ensemble at your school, you're in a competition of sorts. And the important thing in my mind to remember to make it a healthy competition is to do the best you can. Prepare yourself as much as you can. Put forth your best effort and be more concerned about what you do as opposed to what the people around you are doing. And that, to me, is a more healthy approach to competition in music.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you mentioned it a few minutes ago when we talked about your career as a composer, but do you have any other thoughts about how you achieve a work-life balance?
Yeah, there are times when it's really important to just kind of walk away from the music project and give it a few days off and go do something else, ride the bike or go to a movie or read a book or do something else. It's easy to, particularly in my position where I'm, involved in management of a company and I'm co-owner of a company and I'm writing music for the company. I'm so wrapped up in the things that we're doing here, and I feel an obligation to be strongly committed to everything that we do, that it's easy to get sort of overconsumed by what's going on here. So it's hard for a lot of people to step back and move away from the job for a period of time to have personal time or family time or me time, whatever it is that you need to kind of unwind. But it is hard for a lot of people to do that. And I see this in a lot of teachers, a lot of really good teachers, people that really work hard at their jobs teaching music. But as we all know, being a band director is not a 9-to-5 job. You know, your summers are involved and your weekends are involved and your evenings are involved. And even if you don't have a rehearsal or a sectional or a recruiting program or whatever, you're always thinking about it. And so it's important to find ways to unplug and de-stress from the job. And some people really have to work at it. It's a challenge, but it's very, very important that everybody finds a way to do that.
All right, Andy, here's the big question of every interview, and that's, what are the challenges facing music education and band, and how can we best meet them?
Well, I think there are a lot of challenges facing music education. When you look at public school music, obviously funding is a big problem with a lot of schools. You know, there are a lot of bands that don't have funding problems, and there are a lot of bands that do have funding problems. And we've been hearing this over for decades. It's gotten particularly acute in certain parts of the country in recent months and years. But, you know, funding is a big part of it. If your school district doesn't have the money to pay music teachers and buy music and do those things that you need, that's obviously a challenge. And bands are, particularly at the high school level, are usually tremendously visible. They're a great part of what's going on with a school's curriculum and with its visibility, performing at the football games or in parades or at competitions or whatever they're doing. So a lot of times when financial times are tight, school districts kind of look at the arts and they start shooting down things there. But I think they really are short-sighted when they consider what they're getting back in return out of some of their musical curriculum offerings that they have. So I think the funding is obviously one big aspect of it. Another area that I think is less recognized as a concern is the fact that we obviously live in a different age now than when you and I were going through band. There's a lot more competition for students' interests and their participation in activities. And when you look at learning how to play the clarinet or learning how to play the trombone, you know, it's a lot of work to do that. You have to practice every day and you need to do things that your teacher tells you to do. And the results are not immediate. It's something that you have to persevere with and work hard at in order to be successful. And I believe that a number of elements of a young person's life these days kind of lend themselves toward the idea of instant gratification, whether it's playing a video game or some other activity that isn't as much work as learning how to play an instrument. So I think whatever ways teachers and administrators can find to help support the idea that learning an instrument is worthwhile. And even though it's hard work, it's something that if you do it and succeed, you'll feel really good about what you've accomplished. I think communicating those elements are very important toward trying to keep encouraging young people to get involved with learning how to play an instrument. And, you know, this doesn't really address music education at the school level, but the other side of that, one of the things I enjoy is seeing groups like these New Horizons bands who are typically senior citizens that have never played or are coming back to playing after decades off of an instrument. I think that's great to see people getting back involved in music or discovering music initially as seniors and having a level of music education there. So that illustrates that music can be a lifetime activity. And it's hard for a 10-year-old kid to think in terms of a lifetime activity, but you know, that's one of those things where you can always say to your ex-student years later, see, I told you so.
All right, Andy. So imagine yourself, the 18-year-old staring across the graduation dais. What advice would you give yourself?
Well, that's an easy one. I would tell myself to be more serious about music theory studies and more serious about taking piano lessons in piano class. because both of those are fundamentals of music. Whether you're a performer or a teacher or a composer or a publisher or an arranger or what, I did not apply myself in formal studies of composition or piano, and I regret that to this day. I feel like it's held me back. So I would tell myself, don't blow off the music theory classes, don't blow off the piano classes, practice the piano, learn how to play the darn thing, and it'll help. It'll help in the long term. So that's an easy one.
If you could plan it out, what would be the final work that you'd like to conduct or hear?
Yeah, I don't know that I could really come up with one piece. I mean, I'd probably give you one answer today and a different answer tomorrow,
Sure.
just depending upon my mood. I think there are so many wonderful pieces of music, both for band and orchestra and all kinds of ensembles. But I've always there are a few band pieces that I've always really, really, really loved. One of them is Claude Smith's God of Our Fathers. And one of the reasons I mention that is because I played that when I was a senior in high school in the Missouri All-State Band, and Claude was in the audience. And as you may know, there's a point in the piece where it reaches a climax, and there's the chorale with an optional chorus. And the room was filled with parents, but also music educators. And to hear this sung in parts beautifully by all of these music people was just thrilling. And it's such a beautiful piece that Claude did using that hymn. That's one piece. Another piece is, and you may or may not know this because it's not the most well-known piece among today's band people, but there is an operatic excerpt for band from the opera André Chenier by Umberto Giordano. And I think it has some of the most amazing moments in all of band music in this piece. And I've got to conduct it once, and I thought I was going to fall off the podium. I was so excited. I mean, it was such a thrill to conduct this gorgeous, gorgeous piece of music. So those are a couple that come to mind. And, there could be any number of others, Barnum and Bailey's favorite, the greatest circus march ever written. What's to not love about that? So there's so many possibilities for that piece. It would be hard we'd be here all day. I could list a whole bunch of more pieces.
Yeah, I just listened to Barnum and Bailey's favorite yesterday. I can't remember why.
Yeah, and when you listen to that, think about the fact that the guy who wrote it was 21 years old at the time.
All right, Andy, is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Well, there's always new stuff going on here at Barnhouse, and I'm always working on new projects. One piece that I'm particularly excited about that I did for this year's catalog is an arrangement of the Nimrod variation from Enigma Variations by Sir Edward Elgar. I think that's one of the most gorgeous pieces of music ever written. And for years, I'd been thinking about making a band version of it. And I finally got around to looking at the orchestra score very carefully. And what I've come up with is essentially an arrangement intended for young bands. It's obviously one of those pieces of music that's technically not very hard, but musically it's quite difficult. And so obviously the more mature the band, the better it's going to sound. But I'm quite excited about that. I've gotten a lot of good positive feedback early on here from reading sessions and some other folks. So I'm pretty pumped about that.
Well, cool. All right, Andy, how can people get in touch with you?
I'm easy to find. If you go to Oskaloosa, Iowa, we're the only music publisher in town. So you can come on up and bang on the door. Or an easier way is I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook, Andrew Glover. My email address is aglover@barnhouse.com. So I'm always accessible by email, but there's any number of ways to get a hold of me.
All right, Andy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun to talk about a lot of band things here.